Felicem Natelem Christiomnes. This will be my last video before Christmas, and considering I haven't made a proper response video in almost 2 months, I think this will be a nice present for you guys. The insanity we will be looking at today will be a man by the name of Varg Vikernes, a Neopagan alt-right member who is going to lecture us on how pagan Europe was a paradise and Christian Europe was a nightmare. Now, I am a qualified historian. I happen to have a degree on the subject with a concentration in European history. So when I wreck this man's arguments, rest assured, dear viewers, it's in the hands of a professional. We're not but 2 seconds in already, and we have an unbelievably absurd statement. I want this put in college history courses as a demonstration of how not to describe periods in history. Advanced in all ways. Relative to what? I'm going to take this statement at face value and assume that he's stating that in technology, economics, social organization, morality, and other fields, classical and ancient Europe was advanced. Well, compared to what? To the Chinese? Because that's not true. Compared to the modern world? Because that's not true either. I'm assuming he implicitly means compared to the Middle Ages, which, contrary to popular understanding, isn't really true either, maybe in terms of technology in some ways, but in social organization and morality, well, we'll get to that later. And other cultures had philosophy as well. Confucius and Lao Tzu are believed to have lived around the same time as Socrates. Oh my god, we got shapes! I love how this is supposed to be an argument. Oh, look at these fancy shapes. This should get you to abandon Christianity, right? Except the high period of Viking expansion started in the 8th century AD. Certainly no records of Vikings exploring the vast oceans before then. In fact, Iceland was first discovered in the Middle Ages by Irish Christian monks. Practical ocean-going vessels weren't developed until well into the Middle Ages. A trireme cannot cross the Atlantic, I'm afraid. It's artwork, of course it can't be duplicated, that's the reason it's valuable. Each handmade piece of art contains the ideas and imperfections of the maker. They were never designed to be mass-produced. Oh wait, they were, with the ancient Greek pottery industry. But I think the point he's trying to make here is that before the Middle Ages, before Christianity, European metalworking was so advanced we couldn't replicate it today. Well, they certainly couldn't make plastic back then, could they? But I fail to see how belief in Jesus set back metalworking or any craft. Jesus, after all, was a carpenter. You know, as impressive as that comb is, what was the average life expectancy for Germanic tribesmen at the time? And I think this raises another flaw with this argument about pre-Christian Europe being a uniform paradise. The fact that the Greeks and later the Romans made sure to distinguish themselves from the barbarians, and the endless warfare between all of these Europeans shows that there was no concept of a unified white Europe. Even at the height of the Roman Empire, the West, quote-unquote, or at least what was considered the civilized world, wasn't Europe but the Mediterranean. So this would include places like Egypt, North Africa, and Israel. And the Chinese invented gunpowder, and in medieval Europe they had Toledo steel, better steel-making techniques making this fancy pattern welding obsolete. There are plenty of ornate swords and weapon designs from the Middle Ages. It just happens that after the development of better steel-making techniques, careful pattern welding wasn't necessary to create weapons just as good, if not better, than these ones were. Medieval weapons are seen as less ornate, not because they were less advanced, but because they were more advanced. And this is to say nothing of the fact that non-European cultures developed advanced metalworking techniques as well. It just happens that the ancient Celts were white and pagan. And this didn't change in the Middle Ages. Weapons just got better and more efficient. Pit an ancient Celt warrior against a late medieval European knight in full plate armor, armed with a longsword or a halberd, and he'd kick his pagan ass. Well, what exactly defines a history as rich anyways? A lot of things happening, a lot of technological and cultural developments? Well, that makes the Middle Ages just as rich, if not more so, than the ancient world. And what gives you the right to claim this as your history? You're Norwegian. You can claim a Viking ancestry, but not Western, quote-unquote. As I've dedicated an entire video to, Europe, or the West, is not a monolithic entity. You're basically saying here that the Romans, the Greeks, the Gauls, and the Germanic tribes had no substantial cultural differences, and they were all pretty much the same. Well, that's simply wrong, and I can't understand how anyone could take this understanding of history seriously. Frankly, the only thing that ever did unite Europe in any sort of way was Christianity. Now, would you care to explain some of these traditions and rites for us, Varg? Such as gladiator fights, mass enslavement of people, infanticide, and pederasty? And of course, as a lot of the more extreme parts of the alt-right, like Varg are wont to do, claim all modern society as morally degenerate, even though the exact same sexual practices were widespread in the ancient world, and that really the only thing that actually stopped things like polygamy, pederasty, sex slavery, and promiscuity was Christianity. Ever gonna admit that? So you had cave paintings. You didn't have elaborate architecture and gold combs in 10,000 BC. No, they weren't. The oldest widely known story in ancient Europe was the Iliad and the Odyssey, which was told by Homer in around the 8th century BC. I can guarantee you that the Greeks around that time weren't telling stories of their hunter-gatherer ancestors. But I think the bigger issue is the assumption that these things went away in the Middle Ages, which they didn't. Troubadours and bards fulfilled the role of storytellers and spread news through story and song. And you also had books being written and eventually printed. What? There were not libraries in ancient Germany. Why? Because they couldn't read. I mean, I can't take this even remotely seriously. This guy is claiming that you had ancient tribesmen living in the woods who, even though they can't read and die in their 30s, they managed to build libraries, write down volumes of knowledge, store them in these libraries, and then have an average tribesman be a scholar who memorized all these texts. Yeah, I'm sure that's the case. I mean, what would ancient Germans even write about? Libraries existed in the ancient world, but in the Mediterranean. Alexandria is not in Europe. I really hate this fucking music, by the way.
Lights in the lake, flickering.
And everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked.
I mean, Europe in the late Roman Empire was doing fantastic, wasn't it? No massive social problems, no mass migration from other Europeans, no teetering on the edge of internal collapse. No, because a bunch of Jews, Greeks, and Romans converted to Christianity. This is what brought the Goths in, this is what brought the Huns, and this is what sacked Rome. Unbelievable that this is taken seriously. You know, this church was probably built much later, as were most medieval churches and cathedrals. And survive implies they survived something. This something is the fall of the Roman Empire. The fall of the Roman Empire was not caused by Christianity, and I would love to hear from pagans how it was. In fact, it was the internal unsustainability of the Roman government, along with the migration of Germanic and Eastern European tribes into the empire that caused its fall. If anything, a much more accurate description is that despite the Romans and other Europeans' own destructive tendencies, Christians managed to preserve much of the ancient world through the tireless work of monks and people like the Venerable Bede. And on top of that, they built a new functioning society to replace the ancient world. I think the Goths and the Vandals did a pretty good job of that already. Would you call this the Book of Kells incredibly poor art? the thousands of libraries that didn't exist. And then the Christians, being so backwards and against knowledge, built the world's first universities and taught people how to read and write and copied books because of how much they hated knowledge. See, I like this argument that Neopagan white supremacists use that Norse paganism is this strong, masculine religion of the white man, while Christianity is this weak, effeminate, self-destructive Middle Eastern cult of brown people. Well, if the Norse or pagan gods are in fact stronger, why was it so easy for Europeans to convert to Christianity? Why did your gods do nothing to prevent Christians like St. Boniface from cutting down your sacred trees? And if an average Norse shrine is a sacred grove or a tree, whereas Christians will make proper temples, who seems more uncivilized? Also, for pagans who think that Christianity is fine with mass immigration, the fact is mass immigration happened only after the decline of Christianity in the 20th century. And I'd love to see a bunch of neo-pagans go up as a cultural force against Islam. I mean, it's not like paganism completely lost to monotheists the first time. Another straw man. Certainly I will admit that some technology was lost in the Middle Ages, but this is no different from what the ancient pagans were doing. You think the ancient Celts had real medicine and didn't resort to shamans to heal the sick. And the fact is, the Middle Ages did have an understanding of medicine that was more advanced than simple herbs and incantations. They believed that disease was due to imbalance. It's not accurate, but it is something. Not true, no evidence, and what were you pagans doing to us Christians for centuries? You murdered Jesus for preaching love and charity, fed us to lions for your own entertainment, crucified us as the Romans did, and as for the Vikings, pillaged and massacred Christian settlements and towns and churches, destroyed priceless works of writing and art. I mean, Viking raiders would be viewed back then as we view Islamic terrorists. Again, you did the same exact thing to us for centuries. Oh, so now you address Christians being killed when it's by other Christians. So you lambast Christianity for being a Middle Eastern desert cult, but with Islam it's okay because you think they had a vested interest in preserving ancient pagan knowledge. And by the way, during the early Middle Ages, the Islamic world was centered around the Mediterranean. If you're arguing that a pre-Christian Europe had all of this knowledge, how is it that this knowledge was consistently found outside of Europe? And also, I think a lot of these scholars would have actually been Christians and Jews. Unlikely. Medieval Christian philosophy was largely based around Neoplatonism and was championed by St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. In the Middle Ages, philosophy still existed. There was still a desire to provide a rational understanding of how the world and society worked. And I think you have to admit that Islam can be a lot more iconoclastic than Christianity. Of course, this is to say nothing of how the Chinese were eclipsing everyone, even without any real influence from the West. And since you aren't providing any real evidence of how the Muslims were advanced chemists, and this is all incoherent mess, I'll try and explain it that, while certainly a lot of the medieval Islamic world was influenced by the ancient Mediterranean, because of the trade routes to the Middle East, India, and China, developments like the compass and gunpowder, which originated in China, made their way to the Islamic world and to Europe. Not all of the Islamic developments were from ancient pagan Europe. So, while all this time you and the rest of the alt-right criticize Islam for being a backwards, medieval, intolerant desert cult, you praise it because you think it preserved ancient pagan European culture, and it wasn't Christianity. So why would you be against Muslim immigration anyways? If this is exactly what they were like in the Middle Ages, it's all good times ahead with a Muslim Europe, right? Again, Christianity did not start the Dark Ages, and there is exactly zero evidence to support this claim. Now, if you look at the Middle Ages, let's say roughly 500 to 1500 AD, Europe pretty much advanced quite steadily and developed quite advanced and highly structured cultures. You couldn't have a backwards Europe with a Hanseatic League, guilds, or the Magna Carta. And the current consensus among most historians is that the Dark Ages is actually a myth, that no such time that we envision actually occurred. But the Islamic State practices a medieval form of Islam. Isn't that a good thing? As for intellectual debate, it was absolutely tolerated. Unlike when they killed Socrates in pagan Europe, medieval universities almost certainly had formal and informal debates over, ironically, the issues you think would get them killed: theology. I'm almost certain that the church would have encouraged discourse in theology if it meant more people were seriously pursuing a better understanding of their faith. And I mean, because of technological limitations and the fact that medieval Europe wasn't a totalitarian society, debate and dissent would have been common and accepted. The Catholic Church didn't have death squads patrolling the streets of every town, killing anyone who disagreed with every single aspect of the church. This just didn't happen. Now, let's talk about the 13th century. During this time, you had the Magna Carta written, laying out individual rights. If this is supposed to be like the Islamic State, would such a document even be possible? And also, not everywhere in Europe was a feudal monarchy ruled by the Catholic Church. Along the Baltic, you had free trade cities flourishing, and in Russia, you had the city-states of Rus like Novgorod, operating as republics with free citizens of the town and cities voting. And also, this poor art I'm seeing is a cherry-picked example. I'm dismissing it as actual evidence. I don't think if you asked a merchant from Hamburg how his life was, he would describe it as a living hell. Heck, I don't even think a free English farmer could honestly say that. You realize this was one giant straw man? What is the Crusades? What is the Kingdom of Jerusalem? Where did Deus Vult come from? I mean, it's not like ancient texts had already been preserved by monks for centuries and more works were recovered in the Crusades, but wait a minute. The Greek refugees, they wouldn't happen to have been Christian now, would they? Not really. What's surprising is how often you might say secular a lot of these ancient works are, in that, despite the ancients being pagans, we in the modern world, and in the medieval Renaissance Christian European world, found them of tremendous value. Almost like you don't have to be pagan to learn from Aristotle. Who knew? And that, being Christians, we could build on it. And everyone converted back to paganism, right? Oh wait, until the 20th century virtually all Europeans were Christians. So it's like you're blaming Christianity for everything is a complete and total lie. So the video just rambles on from here about how the Muslim conquest of the Byzantines prompted the Renaissance, which is in part true. That the Greek refugees from Byzantium did transfer lost ancient knowledge to the Europeans is a fact, but it still doesn't make Islamic conquest a good thing in itself. He then goes on to, after thanking Islamic conquerors of Europe for conquering a white part of the world, that they too can return to their ancient pagan roots. How cute. Now, on a last note, even if everything he said is somehow true, the fact remains that medieval Christian Europe was morally better than pagan Europe. Even if you're an atheist, moral subjectivist, I think we can at least, for the sake of a civil society, assert that, putting aside our views for abortion, for now, that killing born babies is wrong. Well, you can thank Christianity for that, because during the ancient pagan paradise of ancient Europe, infanticide was a disturbingly common practice, generally because these societies did not have a concept of all life having value. Babies would be taken before their father, or whoever the patriarch of the family was, and judged if it was worthy of life or not. If it was deformed or unwanted, it would be left to die. Enter Christianity, and as records show, infanticide became increasingly rare, and it was a universally condemned practice. So Christianity meant that less babies were killed. Also, human sacrifice was stopped, and slavery in practice was abolished, and you even had medieval writings condemning the practice as against God's will. Now, I don't think I really need to explain how ridiculous this video is any further. I mean, I'm impressed by the incoherence at least. Aside from all the historical inaccuracies and outright lies, it seems he's praising medieval Islam, something I think those of us who are either traditionalists, liberals, or on the alt-right would be vehemently opposed to. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm off to celebrate Christmas, and knowing that, as Christians are prone to do, we took a pagan holiday and made it a million times better will be all the sweeter. Diabana.
Alles lebe ich, mir werde sieht min sündig Gläubigkeit. Das hehre Land wohnt euch die Erde, dem man so viel nicht. Mir's geschehen, des ich ihr bat, ich bin kommen an die Stadt.